Welcome back to the home front. I'm your host, Reed Galen. Today, I could not be more flattered and pleased to be joined by Dan Osborn, independent, running for the United States Senate in the state of Nebraska. Dan ran last year and ran well above anybody's expectations. He is a former Navy veteran, a veteran of the National Guard, was a union leader at the Kellogg plant there in Omaha, is the father of three, and is coming to us today from his office because he is a working man. Dan Osborn, welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, so Dan, let's go back a little bit. So you are an independent in a very red state. You know, the thing about Nebraska I thought was fascinating, and you've seen this up close, is that I don't remember how many years ago it was, but I believe that there was a ballot measure in Nebraska to raise the minimum wage, maybe to $15, and I believe it passed overwhelmingly. And so I think that a lot of the folks listening to us assume that just because it's Nebraska, it's a double landlocked state, that it's typically red with the exception of Omaha or maybe Lincoln, that it's monolithic. But I think that based on the measure I just mentioned and your race last year and now the upcoming race, I think that bears out not to be true.
Yeah, you know, you mentioned that ballot initiative. There was another one in 2024 to legalize medical cannabis that passed overwhelmingly by over 70%. You know, when you put things to ballot measures and people go and vote in the privacy of their own ballot booth, I think they tend to vote a little bit different than necessarily what the party dictates.
Right. So first and foremost, what made you decide to run for public office at all? I know you've been a leader in your union, but what made you decide to take that step from a job leading working men and women all the way into elective office?
Yeah, I hadn't always been a political person. It really wasn't until 2021, or more specifically 2020. I think you remember what happened that year in the form of COVID. You know, we were deemed essential workers at the plant. I was I was a mechanic there for 20 years, and we were working 7 days a week, 12 hours a day. During that time, we didn't get any time off. There's four plants under the umbrella of our master contract throughout the United States, and we were all working those hours. We made them record profits. They went from $19 billion to $21 billion in that year. The CEO gave himself a $2 million raise, and the board enriched themselves. The stockholders enriched themselves. Capitalism at its finest, right? So our contract happened to expire that year, so we figured it's going to be a no-brainer. We'll get a little sliver of the pie. But instead, at the negotiating table on day number one, they sat across the table from us and they said, we're going to go after your health insurance. We're going to go after your cost of living wage adjustment, which is our only form of wage increases designed to keep us even with inflation. And then we're going to implement a permanent two-tier wage system with no path for a lower tier employee to go to the upper tier. So instead of sharing a little sliver of the pie, they tried to take from their workers. So we stood up and we said, no, we're not having any of that. And we shut down 4 plants around the country and walked off the job to preserve our wages and benefits. Certainly, one of the hardest things I've ever had to do is take 500 in the Omaha version, 500 of my friends, there's 1,500 total, but 500 of my friends and family out into the great unknown, not knowing if we're going to have a job at the end of this. But we all felt we were on the right side of history here, defending what we believe, what we've earned through the course of 60 years as a union. And, we take concessions when we have to. In 2015, actually, we took huge concessions. So when the company's profitable, they should share with their employees. It was our belief. But, out on the picket line, there wasn't any Democrats or Republicans, right? Or there's no black or white or Mexican or anything like that. There's no gay or straight. It's just people that just want to go to work and provide for their families. And so I had to scramble and figure this all out. And I knew the political piece was going to be a big part of it. I knew Democrats were going to come out to the picket line and support us publicly, and they did. But what I really wanted, I didn't understand in my brain why this has to be owned by a party. This didn't make any sense. I mean, we're all Americans. We're all just workers. So I was instrumental in being able to get a U.S. congressman out to the picket line. I was able to get the governor to draft a letter and send it to the CEO, Steve Cahillane, imploring imploring him to get our people back to work. So that was my first introduction into politics. And then I started to really understand the world around me on how much corporations and special interests and lobbyists have the true power in our government. This whole independent piece. I've been a registered independent from the time I could vote, and so now I have some name recognition. And there's some folks in central Nebraska, the railroaders, that were extremely pissed off at Deb Fisher and how she votes on rail against the workers. For the corporations, she was seen in getting off corporate jets, UP corporate jets, and so they had this idea that she was vulnerable to an independent. And turns out they were right. We fell a little bit short, but we ended up getting 47% of the vote in Nebraska in 2024. So this was something, although we did lose, we fell a bit short. I think we did something pretty spectacular, and I think it showed Nebraskans and certainly the rest of the country that there's a need for this brand of politics while we're stuck in the, I think you had him on the other day, the two-party doom loop. I love that phrase, right? Because it's so true. I often feel like a kid who's in the middle of a messy divorce with Republicans and Democrats. Republicans just want to beat Democrats. Democrats just want to beat Republicans. And here I am, trying to operate and talk to people and give them another option of somebody who's not going to be bought and sold by the 1% corporations.
But so take us back through those negotiations with the head of the company, if you don't mind, because you talk about the bonuses. I was talking to somebody else about you mentioned COVID, that when big American companies got these infusions of federal cash, rather than holding on to their employees, they bought back their stock, to exactly your point, which is you goose the stock price. You increase the dividend, you hit a bonus, and that bonus is 7, maybe 8 figures. And the individual workers are just trying to figure out where to go next. And so you go back to the 1950s and the Treaty of Detroit, Dan, right, where there was labor peace and there was an understanding between the executives and the workers that we both needed each other. Right? Why are we so far from that, do you think?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I'm known for the strike at Kellogg's. That's a big piece of kind of my entry into the public eye. But what people don't know is for 20 years, I did nothing but go to work 7 days a week, make that company profitable, sit on grassroots committees, I created and implemented a apprenticeship program for mechanics, so we could pull mechanics from within our ranks and teach them, because we had a need for mechanics. So these were things that I did consistently to try to make the company a better place. So where is the disconnect, right? Where is the disconnect between employee and CEO and boards? And I think it's greed and its profits, really. The corporation has one goal, and that's especially a public company, and that's to enrich their stockholders. And they can't control, a company like Kellogg's can't control the price of commodities. They can't control the price of sugar, flour, everything that goes into their processes. But what they can try to control is the cost of their labor. And that's what they did. They made $2 billion extra that year, and they chose to spend that instead of innovation and upgrading plants and updating it and maybe throwing their workers a bone. This is what they chose to do, and this was all planned out. You can't convince me otherwise. So it's all about pure profit. They probably had a 10-year plan. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in those meetings, but that's where we're at. And I don't know where the true source comes from. I certainly would love to know, and I think that is part of our government's role. I have a libertarian streak where I think a smaller government is a better government, but also our government was designed and set up by the framers of the Constitution to help protect its citizens, and I think to uplift all of its citizens. And you do that through wages and benefits, and that's how you strengthen an economy. If everybody's doing good, then everybody does good. But instead, we're seeing this mass migration of wealth to the top, and for me, it's a race to the bottom. And that's why I want to be in those conversations and get a seat at the table and highlight these issues.
So, that's the one thing, Dan, you talk about. I think every American has a libertarian streak. It's how we came to be a nation. But to your other point, and this is where I think, not to make it too complicated, that the quote unquote size of government doesn't necessarily have anything to do with a government regulating those that do best, or those that make the most money. And that to me is one thing that I think has really been lost over the last few decades too, is that you can say you have to pay a wage or you have to provide said benefit, whatever the thing is. Because if you don't, and this is always, especially for Republicans, if you don't, then workers who are off the line are then going to need to go to the government for said benefits because they don't have a job or they don't have any savings. And so to me, that has always been the great sort of disconnect between reality is, low regulation, all this other stuff. But at the end of the day, you're going to put people back on public benefit.
Right. That's exactly right. And I got a story about that. I tried to get into the rental property field years and years ago. Me and my business partner ended up with a total of 5 investment properties. And we used Section 8 housing here in Omaha because the state always paid on time. They made us keep up with the house, and they made the tenant keep up with the house. It was a good relationship. And I had a tenant come to me crying one day, and she was a single mom of 3, and she said, "Dan, I had to quit my job." And I go, "Why did you have to quit your job?" She goes, "I got promoted with a $5 an hour raise." And so she would have been booted off the program. So instead of, $250 in rent she was paying, she'd had to pay the $800 plus more on her utilities and SNAP benefits. And so why isn't this system tiered? The system's designed to keep them down. And, the taxpayers pay for this. So why aren't we doing anything about that? These are the issues that I just simply don't understand, that I would love to have a seat at the table and discuss this and get things done. Again, it's about trying to uplift everybody. It's about a level playing field. I don't want to play Robin Hood and steal from the rich and give to the poor. That's not what I'm about. It's about, if you work hard in this country, you should be able to get ahead, plain and simple.
Well, and to that story you're telling too, then people who have to make that decision, that have to live through that catch-22, are then subsequently vilified for having made it, right?
Yeah.
And so you get it coming and going. All right, so let's talk about this. You ran last year. Obviously, Nebraska backward and forward. As of this moment now, summer 25, what is concerning you about what you're seeing out there in the Husker State?
Yeah, this bill that just recently passed, the spending bill, certainly raises some concerns. Is it all bad? No, of course it's not. It's 900 some pages, right? There's no tax on tips, and overtime. I've been preaching that forever. I still think it falls a little bit short in those arenas, but also it's a good thing. But what I'm seeing, what I'm afraid of, is Nebraska's a very big ag state, right? You have Omaha and Lincoln that make up about half the population, and then you have the rest of Nebraska that makes up the other half. And the biggest employer in a small town anywhere probably in the country is the school and the hospital in the area. Those are the 2 biggest employers. They took $1 trillion from Medicaid, and they added $50 billion in the final version to help prop up and save rural hospitals. But that's $50 billion spread out between 50 states, spread out between 5 years. And, there's a big difference between Texas and Nebraska. There's a lot more landmass and hospitals in Texas than there is in Nebraska. So I feel like that's going to fall short. We already had in Curtis, Nebraska, an announcement of a hospital closing already. So that concerns me. People should have access to a doctor. Again, like I said, on the picket line, there's no Republican and Democrat. In the back of an ambulance, there's no Republican or Democrat either. You need a doctor, you need a doctor. And I'm afraid that the access to those and affordable access is under threat. And so the second part to that is our ag industry. I think it's $50 billion in subsidies is going to favor the large corporate farms. And we're going to start to see smaller farms and ranches filing for bankruptcy and consolidation more into this corporate style farming. And that can lead to a multitude of problematic issues. you talk about the effect it might have on the environment. Here in Nebraska, we sit on one of the largest freshwater bodies in, I believe, the world, in the Ogallala Aquifer. And farmers and ranchers, they live on this land, right? They have all the incentive in the world to keep that drinking water clean. Do corporate farmers and ranchers have that same incentive? I don't think so, right?
Right. They can pay the fine, right?
Yeah, they could pay the fine. They don't have to live on the land and give that water to their families. So those are the things that concern me. We have to protect our water and our air. I think those are some ramifications that this bill might cause. So I think that bill falls short of protecting everyday Nebraskans.
Well, as you noted, I was listening to a radio program the other day, and I was a financial reporter, Dan, who said the money for Medicaid is going to go away, but the need for care isn't, as you noted. And that could be, going to your pediatrician. That could be going to your OBGYN. And as you noted, I mean, Nebraska is a big state. It's a lot bigger than I think a lot of people think. And if labor delivery units shut down in, a rural area or an emergency department, you're not talking, it's 20 minutes to the next town. It could be 2 or 3 hours to the next facility that can handle something like that.
Sure. It takes me 8 hours to get from the eastern side of the state to the western border. So it's a big landmass. And, the difference is if you have to go to the doctor that's 15 minutes away, no problem. But 90 minutes could be life or death.
Well, and it's also your whole day, right? To your point, if you're working, right, the difference between half an hour drive and a half an hour at the appointment is lunch, as opposed to 3 hours in the car, an hour. That's half a day off of work.
Or if you're a senior and you're not driving,
right?
How are you going to get there? Right? There's no Ubers in Curtis, Nebraska.
Right. I wouldn't expect there are. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about your opponent, Pete Ricketts. So Ricketts is the son of the other Ricketts, right? That out of Chicago, I believe. They own, Joe. They own. I think they own a couple of sports franchises. They own. Was it not TD Ameritrade? One of those.
They own TD Ameritrade,
right.
and they sold it. It became Charles Schwab.
Right.
I don't know how much they still are involved.
But the difference is when they sold, they didn't lose money on the deal. And I remember back, ironically enough, Dan, I remember back in 2015 when the Ricketts family, when the patriarch certainly was really opposed to Donald Trump's nomination as the Republican Party's standard bearer, and then quickly got in line. But, now he was governor, right? And now he's a United States senator. Sass left and he, I think he won the special election. So tell us a little bit about how a guy like that can possibly understand what the individual Nebraskan is dealing with on a daily basis.
Right. It is my belief that he can't. And, when Sass went to the University of Florida, Ricketts' money got our Governor Pillen elected. And actually, there was a guy running against Pillen who was Charles Herbster, who was a Trump-backed candidate. So that's where the rift between Trump and Ricketts came into play. Was Ricketts was backing Pillen because Pillen was going to place him into the United States Senate. So, history has happened. So Pillen gets elected, places Ricketts into the Senate. So, one can argue that his money got him into the U.S. Senate. But again, a guy like that doesn't care if the local public pool closes down because he's got 10 of them, right? How can he possibly approach policy and issue objectively where he came from? And I'm not saying, he was born with a silver spoon. That's great. I think all of us would love for that to be us. But how he has operated in the state is problematic. Like when he was governor, he ruled that with an iron fist, king-like, if you will. Mm-hmm. And anybody in the state, Republican or Democrat, that wouldn't play ball or do his bidding, he would throw hundreds of thousands of dollars against them in their primary, and then you just don't work in the state anymore. So he stacked our unicameral. We have a unicameral. We don't have two houses. So if you sneezed wrong at Ricketts, you don't work here anymore, and I'll find somebody that will. get on board with me. And so, we mentioned ballot initiatives, legalizing medical cannabis passed by over 70%. Well, his money and his loyalists are fighting that against the will of the people, and that's who he is. That's who we're going to get, and that's one of the things that I'm going to be preaching to Nebraskans is I'm not going to be a rubber stamp for anybody. I want to go back to the way this was all intended in the government by and for the people, and Ricketts kind of embodies everything that I preach against. It shouldn't be a government for the corporations and the 1%.
So you mentioned something I want to just drill down on a little bit. So you're running as an independent, as you noted. You've been an independent since you first registered to vote. The Democrats did not put anybody up last year. It sounds like, based on an article I just read this morning, that it doesn't sound like they're going to put anybody else up next year. But also sometimes they get a little frustrated that you're not hewing to the line, which is funny because even when you consider yourself and say, I am outside the system you want me in, that system really wants to pull you back in as badly as it can.
Yeah. I mean, I preach a lot about antitrust and anti-monopolies, but if you think about it, two-party system's kind of a monopoly on politics, right?
Sure.
And so to operate anywhere outside of there could be problematic. It's more difficult to raise money. It's more difficult to get that framework that you need to run a campaign. I believe our messaging is sound. We wouldn't have gotten 47% of the vote in Nebraska if it wasn't. But yeah, as far as the parties are concerned, it's frustrating to me. But the Democrats in the state have the same goal as I do, and that's to get a guy like Pete Ricketts out and get somebody like me in. Although I won't be with the Democrats on every issue, they know that I'm gonna be a heck of a lot better than a guy like Pete Ricketts is.
Right. So let's talk about this. Let me ask you this, again, going back to being a candidate. So you're running last year. You catch fire. The Nebraskans across the state are saying, you know what, I like the cut of this guy's jib, even in a landlocked state. Sorry to make the sailing reference, Dan. And so you're rising in the polls and you're gaining steam. How did you handle all of a sudden? Now you're getting national attention. Now big donors are arriving with money. How do you handle that from the position of, I'm doing this because of what I care about, and now all of a sudden everybody's shown up to try and help? How do you deal with that sort of evolution?
Yeah, it was controlled chaos, I suppose. But the way I handled it is I try to surround myself. I like the phrase, if you're the smartest one in the room, then you're in the wrong room. I like to put people around me that I know are experts in their arena, in their field. And I rely heavily. I am not a micromanager. I rely heavily on other people to play their roles. And my role was to go out and do public events and get in front of voters. And so I did 200 public events. This time when we want to do 300, I want to go to where people work, where they live, where they raise their families, where they're struggling with whether it's education, healthcare, childcare, employment, whatever their issues are. I want to learn from them, and I that's what I do. I learn. Every town is a little bit different. Even in a bigger city like Omaha, every part of Omaha is a little bit different. Everybody has their own trials and tribulations, and I want to learn from that and figure out from them. And I always challenge everybody to come up with solutions too. Naming the problems is obviously always very easy, but the solutions are harder to come by. But I take a little bit from every town hall, publicly advertised town hall that I do, and I take it to the next, and then we grow and we learn and we get better. And so if I make it to the United States Senate, I have all of the voters' issues in my head and my heart, and I can take that to the Senate and hopefully do some good.
All right, last question. What has been your favorite thing about being a candidate now for going on a couple of years?
Well, for 20 years, I was stuck in a factory. I went to work, I drove to work, I met with the same people, talked with the same people, took break with the same people, good people. I'm not saying I don't like those people, but I've always been a people person, and so getting out and actually meeting people, people are genuinely good. I believe that. I know that because I lived it. I met them, and we are not actually divided as people as the media lets us on to believe. When I do my public events as an independent, it's a little bit different than I think if I was a part of a party, because I just don't have a cheerleading squad that shows up to cheer me on. It's I'll have in 2024 I'd have a room full, and half of them would have Trump Vance shirts, and the other half would have Harris Walsh shirts, and we would all be nodding our heads together when we talked about issues and kitchen table issues and how we resolve them. Sure, there was some conflict, but for the most part, we could all find something to agree on, and that's what I try to focus on.
Well, and as you noted, I think that there is something absolutely refreshing too about someone who's coming to this with a level of personal experience as so many of these voters probably are not used to seeing. But also, there might be something nice for someone in a Harris shirt and a Trump shirt to be able to sit in a crowd in front of the same guy and listen and nod their heads, right? Maybe that's maybe a little bit of a weight off your shoulders. You can let the angst and the anger and the fury go for a second, because you're like, oh yeah, to your point, like we're not all that different. But the calculation is, how do I keep people as mad as I possibly can, as long as I can? Because if they're mad, they're not thinking, and if they're not thinking, I can do whatever I want. I'm sure that's what a guy like Pete Ricketts is counting on.
Yeah, that's it. He wants to rile people up, make them mad, and that's going to get them out to the voting booth. I'm sure in his mind that's going to get them out to the voting booth to vote for him. He started his negative campaign the day I announced, and I'm just hoping people finally will see these negative ads and just be like, wait a minute, he should be touting his accomplishments and the things that he does and the things that he wants to do to uplift Nebraskans. We're going to have to be effective messengers. We're going to have to win this thing on the ground. I'm not going to be able to compete with his money. We're going to need money of our own. But to touch on that, we raised $14 million in 2024, and our average donation was $37. So right. I like to believe it was powered by the people, and I want to do it again.
Well, on that note, Dan, before I let you go, because I know you're busy, I know you're working, you got folks to see and things to do.
Yeah, you're going to get me fired.
Yeah, well, I don't want to do that. All right, so let everybody know before I let you go where they can find out more about you and where they can find out more about helping the campaign.
Yeah, a good resource is Osborn for Senate. That's OSBORN, no E at the end of it, but forsenate.com. And, I try to be as transparent as I can on that website as far as where I stand on issues. We put all our press stuff on there. Hopefully we can have this video on there. And so it's a good resource for people to go learn a little bit more. And as our events accumulate, hopefully we'll have some good content on there as well, and what the sentiment of people in Nebraska is currently.
Well, I have no doubt about that. As always, gang, you can find me on Twitter, TikTok, and says.us at Reed Galen on Threads, and Instagram at Reed_Galen USA, and of course over at Substack, the home front. Dan Osborn, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Reed. Thanks for having me.
And I hope you'll come back a little later in the year. Otherwise,
for sure. Yeah.
Everybody else, get out, check out Dan, and we'll see you next time.